Okay, so Natalie, are there other than panelists, are there people here as well?
Yes, we do have a
Okay.
number of attendees with us this morning.
Oh, great. Perfect. Well, I just want to say good morning, everyone. I'm Liz Grassi, and I manage the Climate Change Research Program at the Strategic Growth Council. I wanted to just welcome you and thank you for taking some time to hear about this project that we are funding. As you may know, the Climate Change Research Program was created in 2017 to look at how to bring research into action, especially around mitigation and adaptation. We've provided funding for 20 projects, about 34 million. And this year, what we decided to do with some of the funds that were returned to us is really look at research in kind of a different venue instead of having we've done the open source kind of grant making. And so we had some money left over, and we thought the best way to use it was to really work with researchers to find out how they can better support communities and better work with non-academics to make sure that research is being used and is being useful. We do have a participation model that we've created, a research to policy model that we've created, and that's part of this project that CSU is working on to really look at best practices and case studies and really create opportunities for researchers to learn from each other and to learn from community partners, which is kind of what we preach here. So I think with that, I'll just go ahead and give it to Steve so he can start the process that you came to listen to.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen and launch our slideshow. So the origin of this project, tracking the impacts of actionable research, and Elizabeth gave you some of the background, was that by the way, I'm executive director of an entity called CSU-WATER, which spans the California State University system, and I'll cover a bit more in the introductions. But I had some interactions with the Strategic Growth Council and specifically Trey Spikes, and that led to him approaching me about the feasibility of this project, and Elizabeth gave you some of the background there. So without further ado, we want to go over some of our objectives and work plan here that were done in coordination with Trey. So our agenda for the time we have in this workshop or webinar is to present the project framework, some team introductions, the objectives of the projects, the deliverables, which have a regular check-in cycle, some of the resources we'll use for the project to meet those objectives, and then hopefully you have a nice, engaging, and constructive Q&A exchange session with the rest of our time. So the framework is to create better connections between academic researchers and the communities in which so many Californians live and work, and especially those that may have low resilience to climate change and other impacts that are connected to water and energy, for example. So oftentimes academics sometimes work in their academic bubbles in their classrooms, their students, but we're seeing new models and approaches throughout the CSU system, for example, and the UCs to more closely engage academic researchers with communities and students, because our students are of those communities, and hopefully through that process in their academic and professional development, these students will be the leaders on some of these climate resilience fronts in the near and long-term future. So overall, we want to look at basically how can academics, NGOs, and agencies work together to have more impactful research efforts that are collaborative and meaningful and long-lasting. And then how can granting agencies, such as the Strategic Growth Council, ensure that that funding will have meaningful community outcomes that are lasting and that don't end when the grant ends. So team introduction. So I'm Steve Blumenschein, Executive Director of CSU-WATER, and we'll just go through some quick overviews here. So in CSU-WATER, I'm so excited every day to have direct engagement with the CSU system main components like students, faculty, and administrators. And actually most of my time though is kind of creating opportunities and linkages with the CSU entities and personnel with California stakeholders like state agencies and NGOs, in water stakeholders, whether it's in ag, communities, or environment, for example. And another piece I want to add to this with respect to CSU-WATER and our external networks is a unique partnership that was created through an MOU with something called the EPIC Network. And that stands for Educational Partnerships for Innovation in Communities Network. That is a global entity, of course, focused in North America. But our MOU solidified a partnership status where CSU-WATER is just one of 9 partners in the EPIC Network. And their main goal and reason for existence is to unite the human capital of universities with local governments, communities to improve the quality of life and social wealth for all involved. So this was perfect, almost temporal coherence with the presentation of this project idea by Trace Spikes on behalf of the Strategic Growth Council and our linkage with the EPIC Network. It just seemed to come together really well. And with that, we'll turn it over to the other team members, starting with Chris.
Chris, you're muted.
Thank you. My name is Chris Hawley, and I've been bouncing back and forth a little bit between academia and industry for about 35 years, working on large scale technical projects, and large scale in this context is kind of 200 million to 2.5 billion projects with multiple stakeholders. And so I've been working in this area of creating relationships for quite a while. And at the moment, I am what we're calling the Education into Action Program Developer for CEI, the Center for Environmental Inquiry. And we focus on engaging NGOs and government agencies and industry with our faculty and students to work on complex urgent issues. And our goal in life is to get students of all disciplines involved in the community in solving these problems. And as Steve alluded to, and as Elizabeth alluded to, my very strong belief is that if you focus on the relationships and maintaining those relationships, the projects follow, rather than focusing on one-off targeted issues. And so by focusing on relationships, these projects just snowball and make a real difference in the community.
Thanks, Chris. Claudia?
Hi, I'm Claudia Luke. I'm the director of the Center for Environmental Inquiry at Sonoma State University. And I won't say much except that I've worked in this field as well for about 25 years in field stations and marine labs, building these academic community collaborations where to work together on challenges.
Thanks, Claudia. Jessica?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from gray Los Angeles at Cal State LA. So I am assistant professor in geography, but I am an urban planner by training and by practice. So I have over a decade of experience working for community-based organizations on community engaged design and research from the community, and I'm now shifting towards the kind of academic side. And so I bring that practice to this team as kind of a faculty expert in community engaged research.
Thanks. Let me add, Jessica was specifically selected among our content area experts among the CSU faculty that's in our CSU-WATER network. Aaliyah.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name's Aaliyah. I'm the student research assistant for this project, and I'm a third-year undergraduate student at UC Santa Barbara, and I'm pursuing a degree in environmental studies and political science.
Thanks. Elijah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elijah Banda. I will serve as a project manager for this project. I'm a project manager for CSU-WATER as well as the California Water Institute at Fresno State. And I received my bachelor's degree from Fresno State in city and regional planning this past year in 2022.
Thanks, Elijah. Now, Chris, you can take over project objectives, please.
Okay. Yeah, so for this small grant, we're really looking at best practices, looking at some case studies, and developing tool sets. And tool sets is an interesting concept because, on the one hand, you can think of tool sets as helping SGC evaluate grants and making sure grants have achieved their objectives. But in our heads, this is really a complex culture where you really want to change the investigator culture, the faculty culture. You want to change the NGO culture, the community culture, to really help everyone work together. And so our goal is to really have tool sets that can really make strides in forming relationships, changing cultures, and getting communities and universities to work together. And in particular, as Elizabeth alluded to, this year some competitive grant processes happened, but in different years, you may decide that there's other ways to be more efficient or award money differently. And so hopefully the tool sets will be expandable to these different cases. Next slide, please, Steve. And so our first project objective is to really summarize best practices and community engagement for academics. And, as Steve mentioned, EPIC-N and CSU-WATER have a formal MOU, and there's a kind of a large list of different ways you can think about and frame research to help people in planning their grants. And these are just 3 examples. And in our work, for example, we have found the UN goals very helpful because we work with water issues and homeless people. And so having the UN and California come out and say every individual has a right to clean water, for example, has really helped us push solutions for homeless individuals in Sonoma County. And the other one I'd like to highlight is the ripple effects mapper. And I like to think of that in that way because, for example, you start to work on water and then suddenly you're working on homeless issues, and then suddenly you're working on, community communication between politicians and the local community, and you just start to rope in more and more and more faculty and students and community members working together and making a difference. And so it's just like dropping a stone into a pond, and it's a very powerful way of looking at things. And they're helpful because they actually write down what people should do in order to make a difference, in order to think through things. And so we found them very powerful. Next slide, please. And our second project objective is to identify what's working and more importantly, maybe what's not working. And the plan here is to take 2 or 4 selected case studies from California that have demonstrated the power of this approach of trying to create these relationships. And this is where we hope to open up the discussion a little bit, because we certainly have experience in seeing what's working and what's not working, and in particular in regards to granting programs. And just a note on this, this is kind of new-ish, right? Trying to break down these silos between the university and the community, and it can be very difficult. And so traditional granting programs, depending on who your reviewers are, may or may not have the experience or the knowledge or the patience to actually try to view this world through a different lens. And I can comment more on that in the discussion. But we're hoping to not only bring what we know about what's working and not working to the table, but we're interested in hearing from SGC and all of the member agencies as to what they have found that works and doesn't work and meets their goals. Next slide, please. And our third project objective, as I said, is a tool set. And in regards to this, we've obviously split it into pre-award, into the grants, and then the post-award process. And so pre-award, you really want to help people frame what they need to do in order to meet the objectives, in order to establish these relationships, in order to make sure that they're meeting both the community goals and the research goals. And then the grants, that part of the grants is just to help people flesh out what they're actually doing for research and implementation and measurable impact, but also to help guide evaluators and partners and SGC in framing the potential effectiveness of the grant application, because that can be very difficult because there's so many moving pieces. And then post-award, obviously, you'd like to follow up, you'd like to get feedback from the community, you'd like to see if this made a difference, and you'd like to see if it made a difference for the students. You know, one thing that I think we could all get better on is tracking workforce development and tracking how many students of different disciplines we've gotten engaged in these processes. And one thing that I've been personally really excited about is seeing engineering students suddenly realize that they can make a difference studying climate change or animal movement or air quality issues, or philosophy students realizing they can actually go have a career as a water manager because the questions they ask are really pertinent to a just, equitable, fair distribution of resources. And so the follow-up and the post-award impact, I think, is something that we could really work on. And we would also love to hear your opinions about what that should be. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Steve. Yeah. There we go. And then finally, we'd like to provide recommendations for refining SGC and member agency practices, such as the Department of Natural Resources or Health and Human Services, because these problems touch on everyone. So for example, we're studying homeless issues and we're trying to help homeless encampments and help cities, plan for individuals experiencing homelessness a little better. But as part of this, for example, we are working with West County Health to provide mental health services and counseling and to steer people in better directions. And so, like I said, this covers a wide range of topics. So as part of this, we will review current request for proposal guidelines. And then with your help, we will provide initial recommendations for aligning with best practices. And I just want to focus on that a little bit because this is an area where we can actually think about what the culture of NGOs and government agencies is and try to marry it with the culture of universities, which have a different focus and a different, research focus and a different faculty are trying to climb the ladder, and maybe trying to tweak both of those a little bit to make the process, the marrying of these two cultures, easier. And then we're going to present the results and recommendations for a more general approach for scaling up to member agencies. That's it.
Thanks, Chris. That's great. And then as we head in towards our open period of question and answer and discussion, we just want to lay out some of the logistics. And so in consultation with Trey, we made this kind of a longer project so that we could focus on the individual tasks or objectives sequentially, but building as we work towards refining SGC practices, which will include greater engagement with SGC as we go towards the end date, which seems like a long way away, how it always is, the end of March in 25, but it'll be here sooner than we know it. And then Chris, I believe you were going to cover this model, right?
Oh, okay. Sure. I thought, yeah, so in terms of resources, we're really looking at this as a partnership. And, part of the exciting thing about this is, so our partners, when we work with Sonoma Water and the North Bay Watershed Associations, and they've asked us to present this exact presentation at their annual meeting in about a week. And so I talked about this with them, and the resources we'd like to draw from obviously are academia, and we represent that largely, although we try to work with government agencies and industry and NGOs. And these other water agencies and agencies also have success stories, what they've seen that works, what they've seen that doesn't work. And one of the interesting things, we not only want to get lessons and possible case studies from them, but one of the interesting things in establishing these long-term relationships that we've seen is the simple act of convening people that are in different agencies and different disciplines has led to change in the county. And so over and above, the feedback we get is, we have board meetings, for example, for some of our topics, and we draw from, people all over the county. And the comment has been that change has happened in the county simply from the act of us convening these board meetings and having these relationships. And then in addition to that, we actually make the change in the county. And so I just wanted to mention that there's an opportunity here to not only engage SGC and the state and member agencies, but these other folks that have a real stake in making changes.
Thanks, Chris. Well, let me add on here, this intersection of best practices, which brings together these 4 components, that's kind of where I see CSU-WATER lying, because we're a system entity. And so our mission is to take this academic part and make these linkages here. And it's on us as an organization to communicate all these components towards best practices. And I want to offer that is very broad reaching and has tremendous potential. For example, we've formed several entities in CSU-WATER in the last year, one of which is a campus representative network. And in our meetings, we're very excited to talk about curriculum that could be shared across the CSU system in the 460,000 students across the 23 campuses. And for that modern curriculum and, let's say, classroom exercises that hopefully involve communities, we want to be able to have academia more flexible than it has been traditionally, in that we seek input from government agencies, industry, and NGOs on what do you want to see among the 130 graduates that come out each year from the CSU system? How could they best adopt to the workplace? Because honestly, academics, and I'm speaking from a long history of that, we tend to be in our bubbles and our obligations on campus. And we need to hear from these other 3 entities about what to bring into the classroom to our students and how to bring communities into that fold. So part of what we want to do here to kind of segue into the exchange and Q&A is who else should be included. So we don't need to go into this in detail, but we could have framed this table in a couple different ways, but we looked at an academic side. Okay, so who do we know in our system and on the CSU, for example? We could maybe even include community colleges here to network there. And then we have our government agencies, industries, and NGOs with Epic Network at the top, and some others that we're aware of or collaborated with. So for whether it's for the discussion that follows here or longer term exchange, hopefully there's a mechanism by which we could receive contacts to engage for this project and some of these broader goals that we've discussed. So we have a little more than a half hour left. All right. So for our Q&A session, we came together and pulled together these bullet points, but we have flexibility in this as well. But let's think about things like other tool sets that you have seen and like. And this could be where you get back to us, through Elizabeth or Trey or directly to our team. With that, we'll build that tool set out. What about success stories from your most recent program? I'm sure those will be really valuable for us to examine in our kind of meta-analysis here in this project. And then I think as a team, we're really interested to hear about challenges that you faced about this issue, about community engagement and the efficacy of academic research on those fronts. And then other practices rather than traditional grant programs that you'd be interested in exploring. And I don't even want to guess what that might be. I'd love to turn it over to our colleagues on the non-academic side for more about that. And I think that's going to be our last slide other than the contact info here. But again, our point person is Trey Spikes with SGC. And
so Steve, we actually have 2 questions already that came in, or questions, comments. So one, Eddie Ocampo suggested a community navigator approach. And so Eddie, I don't know if you're able to see kind of my comment / answer to that of whether there are best practices or projects that you know of. Oh, here we go. So he's suggesting sustainable energy solution programs has worked in terms of outreach, education, and engagement. And maybe is still maybe got cut off a little bit. So while he's still typing, and I guess Elizabeth, is there any way for is the only way for attendees to comment is through the Q&A, or are they also able to?
That is a Natalie question.
Oh,
Natalie,
Natalie.
can
I-
you?
Well, is the Q&A saved, like chat?
Yes.
And if not, I'm regularly in touch with Eddie and Tamara, you know, and other business, so we could
Yeah.
follow.
So maybe Steve, I don't know if you're able to answer, or anyone, Chris or Claudia, Tamara's question on whether we know the status of these programs, if they're still active, and if there's interest in leveraging resources to increase capacity in an effort long term.
Yeah, we're aware of those. In fact, let me highlight number 5. I'm drawing a blank. The first name of the person running that is Aaron, and they are having a huge 2-day webinar with some 70 speakers through their initiative for climate leadership and resilience. I'll try to share that with SGC, Elizabeth, and Trey. I'll send that to you if you don't have that already, for example. So yeah, we'll check on those programs. But Tamara, there are these in the CSU system, as well as I think 90 other programs, whereas we're a partner, but we'll work with EPIC-N on this, as well as other relevant objectives in this project. And Eddie, I'll follow up with you about your suggestion here. I'd love to get you in a team meeting so we could hear more about that. Aaron Purse, right. So Elizabeth, how do you want to go about this? So we have the Q&As here. Should do you want to moderate that, or should we kind of go over these and discuss, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, it looks like mostly people are giving you suggestions for programs and projects, so I think we can kind of go through that. I think a couple of questions that I have are basically, number one, about how do you get researchers to care about this, right? I think as we know that traditionally in the academic model, academia doesn't reward this sort of work over things like publishing and presenting at, you know, esteemed conferences. So I know that Chris talked a little bit about working with the students who are hopefully future academics, but really kind of looking within your own system. How do you engage the researchers to think this is valuable?
That's great. Let me tackle that from the academic side. So in my home campus and college, which is at Fresno State, I was on the College of Science and Math Personnel Committee for 5 years and chair of that for 3 years. That's where we review all of the tenure applications and sabbaticals and promotions and things like that. And over the years, it moved towards rewarding student research and academic mentorship by faculty. So that counts towards your promotion and retention. And I think what I'd like to do here is get the community more in the spotlight. So I'm slated to address some of the dean's councils, like for science and math, engineering, social science. And so on those agendas, I could kind of see where they are or nudge them towards having in their tenure and promotional review packages some component of reward for community engagement, particularly as it involves students. And one of our first webinars at CSU-WATER was some experts from our CSU system about how faculty can best do that. And we have that recorded on our website.
I'd like just to add to that, that is so critical. So many, I mean, but behind that question, there is so much. So for Sonoma State, we actually have community engagement is part of the RTP promotional process. And that definitely helps us in recruiting faculty to be part of this. The other thing that helps is that there needs to be some kind of funding that's associated with this. So we offer in our programs $10,000 for faculty student research teams. And then the other thing is you need to have some kind of intermediary like the Center for Environmental Inquiry who can crosswalk the academic structures and rewards into the community needs. And part of that crosswalking is to be hoofing it around campus, knowing what people's interests are, but also tailoring the size of the engagement to the availability So sometimes people have a class and a lab in their class that they're willing to, oh, I could devote that lab in the class to analyzing this data or doing, research. Some people have a master's student who can work on this thing for 2 years. So that kind of incentive, being able to scale to available time, resources, and interests is critical.
I think I'd like to also follow up on that. I've been having conversations with various faculty, and it is heartening to see that there are departments that are including this as part of their retention process and evaluation process for faculty, and some departments aren't. And so if in the traditional grant model, as funders, SGC has the ability to say, well, we are going to require your institution to include this in the RTP process, right? You've got a big hammer there. So you can actually do that and try to change the needle. But as Claudia and Steve have both alluded to, often this is just an additional burden for faculty because they're all busy. And so in that sense, a traditional grant process doesn't really help in the long term move the needle. But looking for agencies that are actually doing this, that establish relationships that can then walk pieces, small pieces or big pieces to various faculty, take what the faculty and students do, translate it into an actionable report, which is a skill that a lot of people don't have, and then put it back into the community, focusing on this additional sort of staffing piece that's missing, I think, could be really helpful, because my experience is a lot of faculty really do think this is a great idea. They really do think it's cool. It's just that it's not going to happen because they're swamped and they don't have those skills. And so I think it sort of depends on what your long-term goal is. And this is a big missing gap, I think.
Well, thank you for your insights. I think we're going to go ahead and go through, because we've got a lot of suggestions here, which is great. Who wants to read? I think the first
so Noemi Gallardo had a question on the definition of community benefits. So she's talking about, as a commissioner at California Energy Commission, they work on community benefit agreements. But in terms of, how we're talking about community benefits, is that outcomes or something else? I'm wondering, if Claudia or Chris.
I think what we're talking about is that often the research results get reported, and then they there isn't a receiving entity to say, let's move forward now. And so I think that's what we're talking about, is we have some great research, great information. How do you move it into practice? And so the meaningful outcome that I think we are looking for is action, that there's an implementation component that leads to a change, whether it depends on the research, of course. It could be policy, it could be a new technology is used for cleaning water, or whatever that is, that we're looking for an on the ground, at least pilot project that starts to implement the results that came out of the research.
So I think, just to make that concrete, we have students out measuring water quality along streams to look at the effects of agriculture or homeless encampments or whatever, and often those results would just be presented. Here's what we found, but we're actually requiring ourselves and the students to go the additional step to say, oh, we either found an effect or we didn't find an effect. And if we found an effect and we cleaned up the water, here's how clean it would be, and turn that over to the city of Santa Rosa, and they can use that to actually get funding and water quality credits to install restrooms and showers and drinking fountains. And so it's to leverage what we're actually doing to make a difference in the real world.
Just to chime in too, I got, honestly, on the research side of it, that works both ways. So Chris, what you described is like a dream scenario, but I can admit that the as a researcher, we get funded by an entity and we draw out the linkages in our scope of work and our proposals. And we get so excited about our results and findings, and maybe we present it, but we're kind of waiting for that actionable piece by the managing entity, and it doesn't come. And I got to say, that gets a little bit discouraging, honestly.
Right.
Like, wait, we could really make a difference and help. And then it works both ways. So the academics can't just push because they don't have the authority. In other words, in my engagements with federal and state entities or even students or NGOs, I said, I'm just the objective scientist. I'm not a resource manager. That's what we're contracted for. And that's my role. We're the experts. We could tell you what's going on, what we think with some probabilities and statistics, but we can't turn the dials and screw the screws. So
Yeah.
That's an
Building
interesting
off
point,
of-
Steve, in the sense that that's exactly right. And so you need someone between the actual people and the academics in order to try to fill both of those roles, I think. And that's kind of, so
And
we
it-
have to frame things that they can use, and then we have to help them implement it. I think that's right.
I think it's a language problem. For example, in my position, I'm learning to speak engineer and community service people, for example. That hasn't been my world, really. So I think that there's a communication disconnect or fear of expectations not being met, or here's how our world works and that's your world. And we got to break down those barriers. Secondly, Claudia and Chris, I want to check in with you on this, but I recall some of our discussions in developing the scope of work, and Elizabeth as well. I think it may not be within our scope of work or capabilities of the funding level, but it'd be great to have a dashboard. So this question that came up, how do you define community benefits? What do you mean outcomes? So not just like putting our 40-page, findings in executive summary somewhere on a website, but like more of a usable dashboard for communities, funding administrators, and the researchers to use. And so let me just plant that seed to see where we go in the next year and a half. Chris, remember, and Claudia, remember, didn't we talk about kind of like tool like that? So we could take snippets from Epic and our other sources and put that together, and whether it's hosted by us, CSU-WATER, or SGC, or both, I think would be useful.
I will say that one of our other projects with UCOP, with the climate funds that they got this year, the 80 million, we did the community heroes stipends, and they will be also working on a dashboard for researchers. So I think that'll be a nice kind of proof of concept around that, with the really specific, the 38 projects that receive, like, how do we work with researchers and do a dashboard is one of the ideas that's behind that. But I do think that as we move forward, that is really critical to provide something to make it not just a lot of work, but there's a way to go. And I would ask, before Jessica asks some more questions, just this idea of how do institutions, academic institutions on a broader spectrum give researchers, like, is there a place they can go to find out, like, what are the community groups we tend to work with as a university? Who are the trusted partners within our community in Sonoma or LA or wherever you're at? Is that something that your institutions are providing for you?
Yeah, there's a question from Tamara Wallace about whether we're engaged with the campus community engagement coordinators, and that is on our resource list. Plus, there is a leader at the chancellor's office who I'm regularly engaged with, Judy Botello. So she's like the chief of the campus community engagement officers. So I'm going to get this on her radar screen more than I already have, and we'll go from there. And then also on the UC side, there's a great institute at UC Davis that we know of that we want to hear their input on this as well.
Great. Maybe Jessica can go through the.
Yeah. So so building off of just resources, Walter Passmore suggested the UC Davis Policy Clinic as a model for collaboration between academia and government, and whether this could be expanded to other academic institutions. And I know, Steve, you responded about putting that in the resource list, but I just want to give the space if there were other kind of comments to that question in particular. And then just building off of this question about outcomes, Chris Chaffee, and I apologize if I did not pronounce that correctly, from the Office of Community Partnerships and Strategic Communications has found that on the community side, so they're funding community organizations, right? And so there's a challenge there as well in being able to assess on a daily basis community outcomes and benefits.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think we could all get better at tracking outcomes. And it's an interesting question too, because when do you cut off the tracking? You know, do you say we made an impact and we're done, or do you follow it for several years? I think in terms of tracking and in terms of finding pilot projects, you know, we've definitely found our local cities and our local agencies, you know, to be, we use them to drive the research essentially. And what we've ended up finding is that for all of these projects, we actually need to establish a communication and education portal. So we started to work with media experts and journalists on campus to actually interview these various stakeholders and find out what they thought about the research, how it went, where they want to see it go, and then to establish communication pathways between the underserved communities. For example, in Roseland has a lot of migrant workers, and so to establish communication pathways between these communities we're trying to help and the Board of Supervisors in the local cities. And by doing that, you know, we not only develop the project and say, here you go, but we're going to hear feedback on if it works. And so, you know, again, it's all about these, it's not only the ripple effect, but it's also monitoring these long-term relationships once you've established them. And I think that's a really important part that we're actually starting to explore.
So we're seeing a lot of interest in some sort of ability to externally connect information to others. We have a couple comments on this, just uplifting, Steve, your idea around a dashboard or library resource. And then we have questions from Tamara and Chris about other connections that we've made. So specifically, whether we've connected with the statewide system for service learning and community engagement and the College Core program for students and funding. And then from Chris on relationships with the League of Cities or the California State Association of Counties, considering that a lot of pilot projects for research comes from the local entities.
And Tamara Wallace mentioned, I think I've talked with her about this before, College Core program for student funding. And I believe that's related to community efforts. I think what would be valuable to directly engage students in this, and we're doing this on other fronts as well, like with the water workforce and ag workforce, is peer-to-peer engagement. So we do this on other projects. Like Elijah, we can make YouTube video snippets of students who had very successful and meaningful community engagement experiences is examples to show in courses, you know, to give to faculty, to distribute to students about the potentials there. Because Aaliyah, you know how it is, like you get tired of hearing from us and maybe something from, so you're early in your academic career, right? But what if someone who is a graduated senior is on a career track position with community engagement that's relevant to your major that you're studying? I would think, and I've seen this, the students just light up when they get a near peer addressing that. Could you think of that, Aaliyah, like examples you've seen in your coursework or your university experience so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Like a lot of my peers have gotten, not necessarily like in this sector as far as water or research, but just jobs and career paths within environmental protection, and even if in like the business sector and things like that, that when we hear of it, like we want to learn more, and we definitely want to like keep in contact and build those connections for us too, because I mean, they're also really great resources for us.
So could you talk a little bit from the student perspective? What are some of the like bottlenecks or frustrations about like getting to that point? So maybe that near peer can't, turn the gears to get you those experiences, or are there other bottlenecks or barriers towards student engaging in efforts like this?
Definitely yes, because I feel like our coursework is not always catered towards career or things that are more like applicable. They're very like theoretical and like the courses we learned, they're not really applicable to like our actual lives and like what we actually want to do in the community to make change. And that's more of a secondary thing that's prioritized. And I think that's a frustration. So I think building those connections could bridge that gap. And I think they're really important.
Wow, that's great, because that's what I hear and what I've sensed. And I think if we get like a critical mass, and we could do this through our source group, our undergraduate and graduate research group we put together in CSU-WATER, if we get a collection of student voices and we throw that up to the administration, because academia unfortunately is so top down. But I think through CSU-WATER, for example, we could take it to the system administration and the deans to put it in front of them, because their heads are down looking at their programs. But if we get voices from the students of what they need, and from Strategic Growth Council about what's needed, I hope that would have some traction.
I hope so too, because like I was saying before, a lot of students who are interested in this field, but also just like community engagement work and things like that, they want to be a part of something bigger. It's just the lack of reaching out, and we don't know exactly who to reach out to, because that's another thing. Like you mentioned, like academia is very separated, so it's really hard for us to even know where to start. So yeah, I definitely
Even a poll of students, and we could do this. Do you know where to go on your campus to get community engagement opportunities? And likewise, we asked the campus community engagement coordinators, who's on your email distribution list?
Ooh.
Right?
Yeah.
I could predict where this is going to go.
Yeah.
And we can't just sit here and complain about it. We need to make those linkages. I think this project and this engagement is a great opportunity for that.
Totally, because it's definitely not people engaged in the community. It's definitely mostly academics, and they're reaching out for not necessarily like actionable projects in the community, but just simply coursework.
So in 2 weeks, we have our biannual report to our Presidential Oversight Council, which goes to the head of research in the chancellor's office and 7 presidents that we report to. And I'd love Elijah, I'm just itching to get this on the agenda for that meeting in some way, to see what they hear and think.
So I just want to connect back to the Q&A and the question that Chris comment Chris brought up about connections to the local level, and Noemi is kind of affirming that connection in terms of local government and around, I think, really what was brought up at the very beginning by Eddie around needs, right? Being able to actually assess needs at the start of a project or before a project starts. And so I think that just speaks right to not only the scale between the local and the state level that these funding RFPs are jumping between, but also that scale that we were talking about in terms of the toolkit and recommendations of pre-award, during award, and post-awards. I don't know if anyone would like to speak a little bit more on that. Well, we have about 7 more minutes, I think, for this webinar. So if there's any other questions, and Elizabeth.
I do want to also talk a little bit about some things about our model that we put in place to see how you'll be looking at that and how academia kind of responds. The first one is just making sure that your non-academic partners are included in RFPs, that they're actually getting paid to be part of a team versus just coming to them informationally after you get your findings. So they do feel that ownership. That's a big part of our model. And then second, one that the state's been working on, I don't know how your system or the UC system works with this, but we've really been working on trying to get advanced payment to our partners. So they're not having to be reimbursed for their work, but we can give 25% of whatever they're getting up front so that they have the ability to do the work and they can really count on that, versus having to come up with $10,000 up front to like support your work and then get reimbursed for it. So I was just wondering how you guys are thinking about that as you go forward.
That's a large, I mean, that I think that's a great idea, you know, the upfront payment. I mean, we haven't, a lot of our partners, it's interesting. Our model has typically been that our partners are helping to also fund the research. And so some of them, you know, some of the partners we work with will definitely need to be paid to do some of the work. And then some of our agency NGO partners actually volunteer because we're working on projects they need. They also volunteer to sit on the boards and help direct the research or provide expertise. And so we have a range of options that we work with all the partners on. But I think that's a great idea to actually make sure they can get paid first instead of have to foot the bill.
Yeah, I just want to say that it seems to be really specific to the project and the partner. That just doing it as a blanket thing, like, you know, we've talked about things like this with our, you know, working with a water agency, and they say, I wouldn't even know how to take money, you know, for this is my job, kind of like that. But at the same time, what we've built into grants is money for particularly representatives from underserved or, you know, have financial challenges to be able to participate. And I think that's critically important because, as we know, the best solutions come from a diversity of perspectives. The participants need to be diverse. And I think that's another key, is that to find solutions that are actionable, you need to fully engage both the cross-sector. You need to get a multi-sector look at this. Plus, you need the people who are going to be impacted by it to say, is this a viable solution? So I think that's the level that I think about it on, is a thorough understanding of the team and who needs to be at the table. And then an upfront payment for those who need that fiscal service, you know, support to be able to participate. So anyway, I would just add that to this, is that, yeah, there's nuances to all of that.
Yeah, and adding to that, we have a comment from an attendee that, you know, the ability for researchers to provide incentives or justification for community partners is needed, right? Where it's not like researchers have a lot of funds already that they can hand out to everyone, right? So having a portion of funds for that recruitment and justification is also helpful from the researcher side. And for the person that wrote that, if I'm misconstruing your comment, please add to it.
I think just to riff on that a little bit too, the diversity of opinions at the table is interesting, because some of these solutions or programs can be quite contentious in the community, you know, with right and the left and everybody. And so having different opinions at the table humanizes everyone, and then can be folded into part of your follow-up and public education to try to get everybody seeing each other and talking to each other. And that's been an important part of this.
And then we just have a couple more questions and comments. So Eddie also chiming in that usually in their case, the community members is the only sector that's actually not compensated, right? So that's directly to Elizabeth, your question and concern. And then there was another comment about how for undergraduate students at UC Davis, connections with community partners actually makes all the difference for them. So they're pointing to the Feminist Research Institute and what they offer to their undergrads and graduates as a strong case for this. So it's 10:59.
So we should just thank everybody for being here once again. I think it was really fruitful conversation. Hopefully this is the first of many that we can do to kind of get input and feedback throughout this process. And that's what we really want to do. So Steve, I'll leave the last words to you.
I really am excited about this opportunity for engagement and what will be developing as we learn more and grow and maybe shift our objectives a little bit in exchange with Strategic Growth Council representatives on this project. And we'll be reporting out pretty frequently and really excited to share what we see.
Great. Thanks for being here, everybody. And we'll say goodbye and have a great week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.